I think that's 10:30 on the clock there, so we'll make a start. I'd like to welcome all the members to the fourth meeting of 2015 of Scrutiny and Performance. I also remind everyone that this meeting will be recorded so that the public, if they have insomnia, can actually listen to the recordings, and it helps quite a lot. Can I ask that you all speak clearly into the microphones so that your wise words can be picked up? Item 1, Sederunt and apologies. Lucy?
Good morning.
All right.
Members present, and I have apologies from Councillor Karen Crothers and Councillor Gilroy.
Item 2 on our agenda is declarations of interest.
I would just like to mention that I have actually been a fundraiser for the usual. I just need to put that on record. I don't think that will preclude me from asking any questions and participating, just so it's on the record.
If there's no other declarations, item 3, minute of meeting of 11th of June 2015. Minute of our last meeting is here for approval. I'll take it as a correct record. The only thing is the appendix was sent out under separate cover or by email. Has everyone seen that? Ian?
But page 4, I'm being pedantic, but just for I'm absolutely clear. 12.3 on page 4 of our report, it states, commend the review objectives to include Anna as one of the town centres being investigated. There's a particular project there that looked to be investigated. It's not right in the town centre by any means, so long as I make sure that wording includes it, or should we just take out word centre and being Anna as being a town? I don't know if we need to. It's not in the town centre, it's off town centre, so I just want to be clear the particular.
Yes, but we will include that as part of
Okay, right, cool. Thank you.
Right, well, not a specific item in the minute. Members will be aware that we had planned to have some visits to their council areas over the summer recess to take evidence from our ongoing reviews. While we have had a positive response to our inquiries from Perth and Kinross and South Lanarkshire, it was not possible to get dates during the summer period. Officer are, however, continuing to seek suitable opportunities for these visits, and they will take place in the coming months. So that's just an update on that one. Move on to item 4 now, which is the sort of meat of the agenda today. As you can see, this is the final evidence session for this review of commissioning, and we are delighted to welcome representatives from the third sector. All are very well known and very welcome faces, and we have a note of your names, background, etc. here in front of us. I know that you have had some background information from officers, but before we start, perhaps I could just emphasise that the focus of this review and therefore discussion is commissioning rather than the procurement part. We've done the procurement part and we're looking at the commissioning process more today. Sometimes we might go off script, and I'll try and keep it to that today, but if we do go off script, we'll take the evidence and we'll work through it. We've got some questions that we'd like to ask after your presentation, so David, do you want to introduce your whole team just in case there is some people that don't know everyone? Then we can have your presentation and then we'll ask the sort of wee pointers we'd like to find out.
Okay, yes, thank you, Chairman. Well, thank you first of all for the opportunity to appear before you today and to speak to you. It's interesting, we meet shortly after a little report in the newspapers that talked about the political considerations in relation to funding of the third sector. I was taught that politics is the art, theory and practice of influencing people, but of course it can also be about the exercise of control by the state over the other. So I'm hoping as we go forward this morning that the former rather than the latter definition of politics will guide our discussion this morning. So my colleagues, I'll start on my left with Gordon Mann. Gordon is a trustee of the Third Sector Interface, previously Chief Executive of the Chamber of Commerce, and I'm not going to go into his background prior to that, that would bring back difficult memories for me. On my far left is Dave Bleasdale, who's also a trustee of the interface, but probably more importantly from this morning's point of view, the operations manager of Turning Point Scotland. Turning Point Scotland have been providing services in the region for over 16 years, mainly to people within a range of disabilities, and long-term conditions over the age of 11. On my far right is Sheila McVinney. Sheila is an employee of DAGCAS, Dumfries and Galloway Citizens Advice Service. I'll try and not use acronyms, but it is difficult, isn't it? Sheila also previously, not currently, but previously was a director of the interface, and I think from my perspective, more importantly, a part of the steering group that led to the formation of the interface as it is today, a single strategically driven one. And then next to me on my right is Heather Hall. Heather, I guess, is known to all of you as the founding member of Community Enterprise Trust and The Usual Place. But I think more importantly, in this morning's context, Heather's got over 25 years' experience providing and developing and the regulation of care, including a time working for the Care Inspectorate. So the team we've put together has got a wide range of experience, and as we progress with our evidence, I quite like to do a wee bit of theatre, and we'll do a question and answer session. We'll be putting examples before you, not because we consider the particular issue to be important, but as examples of general issues we think are important in the discussion as we go forward. So with introductions over, if you don't mind, I'll continue. So I do understand fully that we're here today to discuss the commissioning of services, but, and I'm sorry to do this with you straight off, there is a wide range of third sector organisations from whom the Council commissions, procures, or otherwise funds the delivery of services. So I would throw into the mix that from a third sector perspective, the difference between commissioning, procurement, purchasing, contracting, or indeed any other aspect of funding is often confusing. In any case, in terms of the impact on users and carers of services, whether that service is commissioned, procured, in our view is perhaps irrelevant, because at the end of the day it's the person who's received the service is really the most important here. And as an observer, I'll observe that the third sector is not a proxy for users and carers. We are the providers of service, and therefore the views of users and carers about the services we provide are just as important, and we're not here to represent them. So we understand that the advice of the Scottish Government is the third sector, and I would submit that logically, therefore, the local third sector interface, as, and I quote a piece of Scottish Government advice, the conduit between public authorities and the third sector is or should be a strategic partner in the design of commissioning, from planning through delivery to performance monitoring and review. The Scottish Government in various documents stresses that joint commissioning should therefore be much more than a process, yet we would submit throughout Scotland there remains a perception, and I'm choosing my words carefully there, that local authorities are process driven. So as part of our evidence here today, we would submit that together the public and third sector has to embrace radical, different, collaborative culture, ways of working throughout our public services, that if we don't, both our budgets and provision will buckle under the strain, if they're not already buckling under the strain of the economic times we live through. Despite a series of Scottish Government initiatives and significant growth in public spending since devolution, although it's clearly in decline, on most measures of social and economic inequalities, things have stayed the same. In fact, in some cases got worse. And these inequalities account for a significant element of the increasing demand in our public services. There needs to be radical change in the design and delivery of public services, irrespective of those economic challenges, to tackle the deep-rooted social problems that persist in our communities. There are serious shortcomings in the capacity of public services as presently organised. The public service system is often fragmented, complex and opaque, hampering joint working between organisations, which is essential. As a whole, the system can be top-down, unresponsive to the needs of individuals and communities. It lacks accountability and is often characterised by short-termism that makes it difficult to prioritise preventative approaches. Addressing these systematic defects requires a fundamental overhaul of the relationship within and between those institutions and agencies, public, third sector and private, responsible for the designing and delivery of public services. Chairman, those of course are not my words or opinions, so if any of you thought that sounded familiar, it is, because those are the words that were in the report of the Christie Commission. Christie was of course not describing the processes of procurement or commissioning, whatever may be the language of today, but it could have been. So we have a proposition to you today, and that is that working together, we think we can contribute to an improvement, to vastly improving the way in which use of local authority, but I would suggest integrated joint board and also our health services, commission services from our sector. And so today my hope is that this will be the start of a constructive dialogue and not a one-off conversation. In your packs I've included that diagram, it's something that actually took me 20 minutes this morning to find it, even although I knew it existed. I just think it's a very neat diagram for kind of describing the different stages that I think we need to have our conversation at. So what I'd like to do now is hand over to Gordon. And this isn't rehearsed theatre. We haven't sat elsewhere and do it, so we'll just have to see how this goes. It's based on a number of meetings that we had coming up to today, and we thought that one of the ways to sort of encourage a discussion and debate is kind of do a question and answer session and get an idea of where frustrations and difficulties lie. So I stress that's not about the individual organisation, so Councillor Dykes doesn't need to worry when we ask Heather questions. The point is to illustrate issues. So I'll hand over to Gordon and I'll pull my seat back because he's going to be speaking to my colleagues.
Well, good morning everyone. Thank you for the opportunity to come along. I've been cast in the role today as of Grand Inquisitor, a novel one. What I'd like to do is start with Sheila and look at some of the experiences from the Citizens Advice Service. Now, they've been providing a service to the local authority for a number of years. Would you like to tell us how you found this process over the years?
Okay, I think it's fair to say that in line with legislative changes, if I can get my tongue around that, in procurement laws, the process has grown enormously over the years. And I've just put a wee handout together that if I could just pass that around, and hopefully I can talk you through that, because I think it highlights my experience of the process. Okay, I've gone back to 2003 to 2006 when I sort of first come into applications, I think it was, to the voluntary sector funding unit. And at that time, the application was a 4-page form. Now, I've actually got copies of all the applications that I'm stating here, so if anybody wants to have a look at them, they're there for your information. You can see when we move forward to 2006, 2009, the application then becomes a 12-page document. 2009 to 2012, it becomes a 20-page document. 2012 to 14, for a 19-month contract, the process changed and it became an invitation to tender, and we had to respond to 6 specific questions. In addition to that, we had to provide 2p information for over 60 staff. The current contract for 2014 to 2017, we had to submit an expression of interest form, again the 2p information for 60 staff, and the invitation to tender document, when it was completed, was 115 pages with responses to 91 questions. We have another, all those examples relate to our core contract for the service. We had another example of tendering for the money advice service in 2009 and 2012, whereby we were asked to complete a PQQ, which is basically a pre-qualification questionnaire that at that stage determines the organisation's ability to deliver on a contract. This was then followed by responses to 6 questions again, and then we had to go through an official presentation to officials. Now you'll notice further along in that sheet, I've mentioned that the Scottish National Standards come into force. The Scottish National Standards come into force in 2006. DAGCAS attained accreditation in 2008, and in 2009 it became a specification within the contract with the local authority that the service must be provided in line with the national standards. And we are accredited until 2017.
Sure, I think it might be helpful at this stage just to talk a bit about those national standards.
Okay, doke. I have another handout for you. Sorry, Liz. There you go. Thank you.
Okay.
Now, the national standards for information and advice providers provide a quality assurance framework for agencies that are involved in, you can see in the top section, debt counselling, housing advice, income maximisation, money advice, welfare benefits and representation services. Now, DAGCAS provides all of those services. The standards themselves relate to the general management of services, planning of services, accessibility and customer care, providing the service, competence of staff and the agency itself, and the resources involved in providing that service. Now, my understanding is that DAGCAS is accredited across all of these sectors and has Type 3 accreditation, which is the highest accreditation in all but 2 of the categories.
Okay, so if the contract has to be delivered in terms of those standards, who else can deliver those? Who could compete with DAGCAS?
My understanding at the moment is that there's no other agency in the region that has Scottish National Standard accreditation. There could be competitors from out with the area, but there are no agencies at the moment that have Scottish National Standard accreditation. Maybe it's just worth pointing out at this point as well, in addition to Scottish National Standard accreditation, DAGCAS service is provided with a CAB branding. Now, CAB branding isn't just given out to anybody. CAB branding, we go through another audit process, and the audit is with Citizens Advice Scotland, and that looks at professional practice and the process of advice giving and the technical content of the advice that we'd give. So we don't only have Scottish National Standard accreditation, we have an audit that's been carried out to ensure quality of advice for clients through Citizens Advice Scotland.
I mean, what comes out very clearly from that is the amount of effort and staff time that's been involved in going through these processes over the years, time which otherwise would have been spent delivering the service.
Yes.
Are there any ways you think things could be improved?
I think it's fair to say that we're all aware of the changes in procurement laws and the need to obtain best value for the public pound. But as you say, Gordon, I think it's fair to say we're all spending a tremendous amount of time submitting applications for funding. We have another handout for you. This is. Oh, sorry, that's not it. It's yeah. Thank you. Sorry, it's in the pie. It's in the pie. Okay.
Oh, it isn't, right, sorry. It's in my pack.
I think it's fair to say that DICAS is not the only bureau in Scotland that's been affected by changes to procurement. There are a number of bureaus, involved with contracts with different local authorities. So on that basis, Citizens Advice Scotland commissioned a piece of work and asked Lindsay's of Edinburgh to look into procurement laws and how it actually fits with an advice service. Maybe if I could just draw your attention to point 2, and I hasten to add, this is one opinion, and as with all things legal, we'll be open to interpretation and obviously a differing opinions. But at point 2, Alistair Keating suggests that there can be a degree of flexibility in a tendering process. And he seems to suggest that there's no legal requirement to go out to tender for an advice service, but increasingly local authorities are choosing to adopt this approach as a means of securing best value. He then goes on to say at 3.5, he highlights the specifications under the Public Scotland regulations, which I'm not totally familiar with, but he breaks them down into Part A and Part B. He deems an advice agency to come under the specification of Part B, which doesn't attract all the hefty sort of regulations that Part B applications have through the process. But he does then go on to say that the process probably hinges on the council's standing orders. Now, I've had a quick look at the council standing orders yesterday, and it looks as though anything over a contract value of £50,000 is subject to a full tendering process, which is currently what DICAS has gone through. But getting back to your question, how could we reduce the work involved in a tendering process? As you can see from the first handout, when we went through the money advice process, we were asked to complete a pre-qualification questionnaire. Now, I think at that stage, it would give the local authority the information they need to decide whether an applicant is a suitable competitor or unsuitable, and at that stage could progress to the next stage or be ruled out from the process. If, like the last time round, I believe that DICAS was the only competitor for the process. We didn't have a PQQ. We had the full specification document, and as such had to go through the full tender, being the only applicant in the process. Other than that, I think the only option to reduce the process or to change it would be a change to the standing orders.
Okay, well, thanks, Sheila. David, do you want to?
So I know, Chairman, you're going to say that's all about procurement and tendering. The point we want to make here is that that's a really good example of something that should be moved towards a commissioning model. There are a number of concerns I think that members should consider here. First of all, we have problems in Dumfries and Galloway building indigenous resources, and we should be very wary of processes that might lead to organisations based elsewhere in the United Kingdom coming in, being successful in getting a contract and then disappearing. Now, I mean, I don't know of examples of that if it's happened in Dumfries and Galloway, but I'm certainly well aware of examples elsewhere in the country where that's happened. The other point I would make is that in an organisation like DAGCAS, and there are many other third sector organisations like this that have adopted quality standards, have been assessed, you already have, as a local authority, a sense that this organisation is fit for purpose. And therefore, and again, it's why I submitted this commissioning model, it seems to me that if in future the discussion around the delivery of advice services was based on a commissioning model, and that model involved the let's sit down and talk about what we want to see delivered, then let's do it, then let's review whether what we decided we were going to deliver and then analyse the results. That's much more a partnership, a way of working, and I think commissioning can deliver that than is currently happening. So I don't want you to focus in on DAGCAS, and I'm sorry if that would have, it might have appeared that's what we're trying to do. Our focus here was trying to say there are better ways of working right across the piece, and that if you're really serious about the commissioning model, and particularly joint commissioning, then if we were to move to a model where there's engagement with organisations that are fit for purpose, I think we will achieve better outcomes.
A couple of hands went up. Ian and Jill.
Just to kind of make the point, no, I understand better now where you're coming from, then, David, in regards to that. But I suppose it's probably, when I'm looking at it, because we've got some preset questions in regards to, we'll kind of see your presentation, and to give you an example, I'll come back to it, but my one was in regards to how do you see the best way of commissioning across Dumfries and Galloway, Scotland, or even UK, and that one came up as a prime example at that point. So it's just to try and get an understanding. It felt like a bit of a sales pitch here just for a minute, which it probably wasn't. And I've heard it because whoever there, isn't it? And probably a few others. So we understand the place where I suppose the bit that I took of that more than anything was you try to keep things local, and very much I think it comes very much for that. Keep things local, keep the benefit as much as we can here, but it's just that we've got some preset questions, so I don't know how it's going to work out, Chairman, in regards to how we go forward, because it's covering a lot of stuff maybe getting covered early.
Yeah. Jill, you want to come in?
Well, actually, you took the words out of my mouth, because I was going to say, well, we're just, we want to really talk about commissioning today, and you were talking about procurement there. However, I have to say that I actually found what you had to say of extreme interest, because there are we have done a big model on procurement already at this committee, and it's maybe just a pity that you hadn't been one of the people that came to speak about it, although we had people from all sorts of sectors to discuss things with us. But I did think it was of extreme interest, especially I used to do procurement, it's what my qualifications are in, so I think it was of particular interest to me to see what the process is for you and the changes that you've had to do over the years, and hopefully we'll be able to address some of that.
Chairman, I think if I can respond to Councillor Dykes directly there, and also yourself, the point in illustrating that procurement model is not that we're critical of the procurement model, but if I start with a phrase that I know that Gordon's used, procurement's quite appropriate if you're buying a photocopier. Yeah? You can specify what you want the photocopier to do. When you're procuring an advice service or a partnership approach, it's not about buying a photocopier. Therefore, our view is the commissioning model, and particularly the joint commissioning model, and I stress that, the joint commissioning model is potentially could be much more effective, and therefore we need to widen the concept of commissioning to areas such as that. I mean, there may well be others, rather than to do it through a procurement model. So that's the purpose in that illustration. It's not just, there are issues that arise from that, it's the number of pages of forms and so on, but that's the kind of thing that gets bottomed out through a process of joint commissioning where everyone is involved from the outset on what is it we actually want out of this for our communities. And I would stress, and I'm going to probably make this point again today, a lot of third sector organisations are really well placed in terms of their competencies and really well placed in terms of their understanding of the end user that they work with.
Richard?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, a good place to bring in the first official question, so, because to bottom out what our understanding of commissioning is. So what does the term commissioning mean to the third sector in Dumfries and Galloway? Is there a general understanding about the difference between procurement and commissioning?
Well, I said in my introduction, Councillor Brodie, that if you were to go out there and ask the ordinary trustee or employee or volunteer of a third sector organisation, they would glaze over in that question because they don't understand the difference between procuring something, commissioning something, purchasing something, and there's all sorts of other language that we use in our relationship. So generally speaking, if you were to ask that question, I think you would get the answer, no, as I don't understand. Do we sitting at this table and does the third sector interface understand the difference? Yes. And you know, when we came along this morning, my sense was that what we had to say to you was we believe the commissioning model is potentially the one that can work best, provided it is a joint commissioning model, where go back to some of the documents that in terms of reports of various different inspection agencies pointing out that partners in joint commissioning has to be a wide range of people and not just a commissioning officer. So you have the users, you've got the third sector organisations sitting at a table designing a service. Now, what I would also say to you is that's precisely the process, I think, and I may have got this wrong looking at Lorna directly here, that's precisely the process I think that the joint public bodies integration, in short, envisages that will happen both at strategic level and locality level. So I think we here understand that difference, but I'm absolutely serious when I make the point. I don't think we ask that question widely amongst people working, volunteering in the sector, or even some of the trustees, that they would get the difference.
Do you see commissioning also being open to a partnership, not just account, public sector, third sector and user, but third sector, public sector, possibly a private sector person being in there? Because if it was me looking at it, if you're sitting at the table with me telling me how you should design services that you provide, well, what happens if somebody else could do it differently, cheaper, and deliver the same service, but because the way you're used to working, it's your way of doing it? How do we make sure that round the table we've got all the people who need to design the best service we can for the service user to give all the options that are available?
Well, I mean, I would accept absolutely that the private, or as the phrase that's used by the Scottish Government currently, the independent sector, particularly in areas of care, need to be at the table in that. I do think, however, Councillor Hislop, that what commissioning enables us to do, and it'll be the first time, but not the only time I use this word, Lorna, today, and that is, it enables us to move towards a process of co-producing the service rather than going out to some sort of competition. I mean, I think the fundamental thing about the Christie Commission and the report is that simply going out and allowing competition and even concepts of best value doesn't then deliver what the user of the service needs. So you need to have a whole bunch of people around that table in that discussion. I will say that my short experience of working in that way, in putting you first, reshaping care for older people, has been very positive. My short experience of the joint working in relation to integration that has flowed from that has been very positive. So there's already things going on that give me hope. What I would suggest, however, is that we haven't got right down into the guts of service delivery yet in terms of joint and strategic commissioning, and that's where I'm going to find the process. I think we'll find the process more challenging, but I think more interesting too, and I think the outcomes can be much better than they currently are.
Okay.
No, it's just, I'm pleased to saying that, you know, what we really need to do first is identifying the service with all the people involved in that identification moving forward before we try to do anything else. So it's identification of service, in particular bearing in mind who the end users are going to be for that service, and how you can get to an end point with partnership work.
And if I can re-emphasise a point I made earlier, councillors, and that is that the third sector is not a proxy for users and carers. Yes, it happens to be the case that we have a better understanding of what users and carers might need because we have that regular contact, but that does not make us a proxy for the views of users and carers, simply because we are service providers ourselves, and if you don't have that critique of what you're doing, so it goes to the heart of your question, you know, what the third sector does isn't always right. I would never claim that, you know, so you need all those inputs. Yeah.
I think it might be useful to hear from our other two experts here, and then
Experts.
the question. If I could turn to Dave Bleasdale in terms of Turning Point Scotland. Can you let us hear about your experiences in relation to the consistency in the commissioning process?
Yeah, I mean, I think consistency is important. I think some of the discussion that we've just been having is a lot of the way of commissioning services within the region is through a process of tendering, and you've got to wonder why we use that process so regularly in terms of rather than a process of engaging with existing providers in terms of a strategic partnership that David's kind of hinted at before, because we have got already in the region, there are a number of providers with, we would think, the necessary expertise and skills to deliver on services. So the process of tendering, which is convoluted, expensive and quite time consuming, are there particular reasons? Is it about driving down costs? Is it about bringing in new service providers because there's a risk to the provision of services? And if it's the latter, then existing providers are probably not going to be given the same consideration in the tender process if the argument for having the tender is to bring in new providers. So there's a kind of risk to that consistency there. If it's about cost, then we need to be very conscious that driving down cost is not going to lead to better quality of care and support to the vulnerable people that we support. There are also changes in employment legislation that are driving up costs for providers in terms of new legislation around about sleepover rates, round about holiday pay, round about time taken to deliver services in between going from one service to another, and that's particularly for care for older people. Whereas at the same time, we're driving down the cost. So a recent tender that went out for care at home for older people, the hourly rate was set between an hourly rate of £12 and £13 an hour. Now, providers can't do it for that rate and pay good quality pay to staff. And we are reaching a crisis in Dumfries and Galloway particularly in terms of the recruitment and retention of care staff. And in order to deliver the increasing demand that we have to meet the growing demand of people requiring services, we're going to have a better marketplace of people in order to provide those services. So we are going to have to look at a different range of commissioning processes, but we are going to have to look at a marketplace that's going to meet the services that you have to provide across the board.
And do you think the local authority sets the right conditions for collaborative working within the third sector?
I don't think tendering is the right example of collaborative working because it is described as competitive tendering. I think there is a capacity for providers to work together, which might help some of the problems we're facing in terms of capacity. But if we're always faced with a competing with each other, then the capacity and the willingness to work together is compromised because we're always having to compete against each other.
That setting up conditions which are
Yeah.
about competition and
Yeah.
cost-cutting results in a set of behaviours.
That's right.
Rather than creating
a system where we might collaborate and co-produce together.
Okay, thanks, Dave. If I can turn quickly to Heather as the last of our experts. So, but given your experience in the Care Commission of inspecting standards of service, can you expand upon what has been mentioned before in the area of commissioning?
Well, first I want to say I'm not speaking on behalf of the Care Inspectorate here. I'm not working for the Care Inspectorate anymore, but I have had experience of commissioning and of inspecting services and tendering for services and delivering them. So kind of a foot in all of these camps. So with a wee bit of understanding across the board, really. And I think one of the things that I learnt in terms of competitive tendering and that kind of process is that you might take a service out for competitive tendering, and it might be a value-based voluntary sector, and suddenly the staff in that sector find themselves cheaped across to another organisation which they didn't apply to join, they didn't want to work for, they didn't choose to work for it. And what can happen in that service, it's then decimated because, and to give you an example, we attended for a service in Ayrshire, and it went out to a private, re-tendered for a service, and they decided that it would go out to a private sector organisation which paid considerably less, the costs were considerably less, and the staff were told in that service, it's fine, you'll just be cheaped across, it won't actually make any difference to the delivery, but in fact it made a huge difference to delivery, because what staff were saying is we didn't choose to work in a private sector agency, we chose to work in a voluntary sector agency which had the standards, the quality and the values that we aspired to achieve, and the outcomes for the end user, which is the most vulnerable person in the whole of this mix, really. And so what happened was there was a mass exodus of staff. So in fact, the people who were receiving the service no longer got that service because everybody left. So it was a bit of a mess, really. I'm not saying that that happens all the time, but there are costs in commissioning that perhaps are less known and less really understood. If you're driving the costs of services down, really, your services still have to deliver the service, but still provide the supervision, the meetings, all the things that go about making that service a really good service. And when you chip away at that, it makes it really difficult to deliver on that service. So that can be really hard. And certainly in Edinburgh there was a huge mess there around about service delivery, and I was working for an organisation which withdrew from that actually, because we said we cannot provide the service safely, competently, so rather than actually tender for that, just withdraw, don't get involved in that. So there are some costs there that perhaps aren't really well understood.
Heather, could perhaps ask you to put your usual place hat on this time, and looking forward, what's the kind of relationship you would like to have with the authority?
The usual place, and I have to say we have had outstanding support from the council for the usual place and from our third sector colleagues, and it's been a huge success. We've just opened 2 weeks and we were astounded, actually, I have to say, by the number of people that are coming through the doors and the support. And actually what I would really like to say is we'd like to continue that relationship. We're not in a position where we're involved in commissioning services at the moment from the usual place, but what we would really like to do is have a really collaborative approach with the council. We've got a really good understanding nationally and locally about some of the gaps in services for young people with additional support needs, and a lot of these we've actually shared with the council. Council have taken on board and have helped us to grow what we're delivering, and it's still growing, and really what we'd like is a collaborative relationship to continue in there, because we definitely have one now, so I'd like to see that continue.
Alistair?
Can I ask a provocative question? Your work is greatly to be commended. Everybody is aware we have to be absent from Dumfries for the past 3 years to realise the tremendous work you've done. However, do you think your success in collaboration with the council is much to do with your enthusiasm, your knowledge, your drive, and would this be perhaps slightly atypical of the organisations in general? Not that other people are not enthusiastic, but a combination within you, Heather, with your knowledge and your enthusiasm and your drive is perhaps not replicated in other organisations. So perhaps it was a win-win situation for you in terms of the council.
I think, Councillor Witts, you're absolutely right. Heather is and Linda are outstanding examples. There are many more. I believe, and I'm well truly on record, that with the right environment, we can encourage much more innovative thinking. I think out there in the third sector, there's some absolutely fantastic people with the same kind of skills and enthusiasm that Heather's got. We just need to take the plug out and let them loose. Equally, I'm not daft. We've got people working in the sector who are not of that ilk. And interestingly, you know, a third sector interface faces both ways. Our job is not just to face towards you and say the third sector's wonderful as I do regularly. We also have to face towards our own sector from time to time and point out that their behaviours, their standards and their performance is not as it should be, and that's very much a role for the interface to play. So I would like to see lots of people like Heather. I think there are many more out there. Heather's not on her own, but I do recognise what you say, because I used to meet her in the last 3 years almost on a weekly basis. So, but seriously, I think there's a lot more out there if we can tap into it.
Well, we've had the first question. Richard, is there anything you want to add after you've heard other speakers or expand on in your first question? Are you quite happy to?
Quite happy with that.
Right. Marion, do you want to?
Thanks, Chair. There's two additional questions to this first questions, but I'll go. What do we need to do different to move from procurement to commissioning? And I'll just add the two wee bits to it is, what changes does Dumfries and Galloway Council need to make, and also what changes does the third sector need to make?
Well, I said at the outset, I think today is the start of a conversation about this, so I'm not going, Councillor McCutcheon, to sit here and give you a prescription. What I am prepared to do is sort of just respond in general terms and think forward from here. I mean, firstly, what I would say is I don't think this is just an issue for Dumfries and Galloway Council. It will be an issue for the Integrated Joint Board, and it will be an issue for our colleagues in the NHS, and it should be an issue going forward for other public sector organisations, including the police, the fire and rescue service, ambulance service, and so on. Sorry, my colleague Haley has to go for another meeting. So if I can pick this model up, what I would say to you is that we need to develop collaborative approaches where, as Councillor Hislop says, the people who have a stake in the service that's to be delivered are able to contribute to the design of that service. We do it in a way that, and if I can come back, I can't remember who said it a minute ago, but if we come, you know, it's not just about when it's going well. Sorry, David's point about, you know, when something's happening that is unexpected, or so for example, we know that by putting that £12 to £13 limit on a particular tender, had that been a commissioned process, even if you'd had that as an agreement, at some point in this cycle we would have gone, well, hang on, that doesn't work, and we'd have been working to put it right. So it is about a collaborative, and I would, given my background, say cooperative approach. So that's part of the answer. You asked me to respond to you in terms of what should the third sector do. Well, equally, and I made the point already. The interface faces both ways. Third sector organisations have got to learn to collaborate, and I have to be open and honest with you here and saying getting some third sector organisations in Dumfries and Galloway to work with each other is quite hard, because they've been used to this culture of competition with each other, used to a culture of having our finger pointed at them and duplication of service, and rather than a culture of can we sit down round the table and see how we actually deliver better services for the people at the end of the process, the user and the carer, rather than our own little fiefdoms. So there is a distance for the third sector to travel as well, and equally within that, there is ample evidence. I have to say, mostly south of the border, and commissioned by the Charities Commission for England and Wales. There's ample evidence that greater collaboration in the third sector delivers not only better results but reduces costs. So my response to you in terms of what should the third sector do is get to grips with that issue. In terms of the integration agenda, there is an elephant in the room, and that is that integration, if it is to be successful, we will need to recognise that there are services we will have to disinvest from, as well as services that we should be investing in. And that's not just a challenge for the public sector, that's also a challenge for the third sector, because the third sector is we have an embedded culture of we'll just continue to apply for next year's, sorry, it's not commissioning, Councillor Islip, but next year's grant, and it just goes on forever because we expect it will always be that way. So the third sector has to be more collaborative, but it's also equally got to be more enterprising and understand that things can't stay the same just because they think they've been doing a good thing doesn't mean to say that we collectively, in the way I've described, believe a service should be delivered or not delivered at all. So there's a considerable way for all the parties to go. And I would throw back in also the so-called independent sector, particularly in relation to care homes. That has to change as well.
I think I can't remember where I saw it, but in your information we got from you yesterday, there's a bit about commissioning is about getting the provider in at the right time in the commission. Is that right at the start, or is that after we've taken evidence from the service user and then say, this is what the service user wants, what can you do with that? You've also got another side that everybody wants to have the service with whistles and bells on, but we have got financial constraints at our side as well. So when does that need to become a consideration when you're designing, or we are designing, might be the better way of saying it, the new service?
Well, can I answer that by speaking from personal experience? And there may well be colleagues on either side of me have different experience, so I think we should allow them to come in if their experience is different. I worked with what's now the Financial Conduct Authority, but then the Financial Services Agency, on trying to improve the service that cooperative and community benefit societies were receiving from them, which, I'll say this, even though it's being recorded, at that time in 2000 was pretty awful. You could go in 2000 onto a website and get information about a company, try to get information about a friendly society or industrial provident society. It was just non-existent, and the quality of their service in terms of amending rules, they were so far behind what Companies House was doing. It was seriously problematic. They also didn't want the service, by the way. It was kind of dumped on them because those kind of organisations I've mentioned are financial vehicles as much as anything else. We had a conversation with them early on around how do we approach changing the nature of the service, and we said at that time, and I firmly believe that this is part of the answer here, we have to be in at the beginning of the conversation, not halfway through. So the conversation that we had was, well, what is it the sector wants? What is it the people out there actually want? So the end user, and we had detailed conversations around that. In a small way, we designed an online facility so you could actually see information. One of the minor impacts of the fact that there was not online information about friendly societies, industrial provident societies only, is that you couldn't do a credit check. Now that might sound like a small thing, but it's not. You know, so you try entering into a new arrangement with a supplier if they can't do a credit check. So we put that stuff online. And the way we did it was we went through a PQQ stage. On our side, we put together a cooperative partnership, collaboration of a number of different organisations, including ones that knew about the tech side, others that knew about the implications of the law, others that knew about the implications of getting credit checks, and we put our PQQ bid in. There was a couple of other people put PQQs in. What the FSA then did was to establish a preferred bidder. We then entered into a quite detailed conversation that took us from what they originally wanted with bells and whistles. I want to pick up on that specifically, and the amount that they had to spend. And we said, you can't have this with all those bells and whistles, but what we can do is we can focus on A, B, and C. We'll set D, E, and F aside, and we might, can we come back to those at a later date? And we designed something that was different from originally what the FSA might have wanted, originally different from what we might have wanted. But in the end, it was delivered. I have to say it was a piece of IT infrastructure, and it was delivered on time to specification and within the cost. And I'm very proud to say, I had somebody in Westminster say that was about the first time that had ever happened in a government contract. But nevertheless, the process was what led to that, and it was because it was a discussion all the way through, from right day one to the end delivery. So my experience is that if the discussion starts early, you have to go through that phase where you choose who you're then going to continue with, but you keep that discussion going right through this. And by the way, for those of you, we used a methodology called Prince. I'm sure some of the managers are smiling, but right through it's a bit complicated. But right throughout the process of going round this circle, we would have review meetings, and we would say, well, that's not working, so we needed to go away and change something. So we had change mechanisms in place. So my experience is if you have that collaborative approach and you're in at the beginning of the discussion, you can produce something that's of real value. It won't be the bells and whistles, because you're sitting around the table saying, actually, the bells and whistles cost too much, so what do we really need?
Yeah.
And my experience there was that the kind of personality in the room that wanted all the bells and whistles, regardless, had to adapt and learn and understand what the really important things were about the service, rather than just because they wanted it. So that would be my example of the value of a commissioning approach that's collaborative.
David?
Yeah, your original point in terms of where does a provider come in, you also mentioned about the person receiving a service, where they come in. And I think the processes that we have, sometimes they come in at the end of the process, where they should be coming in at the beginning of the process. And I think if we're looking at redesigning commissioning, it's about going back to the individual and designing services round about them.
Right. Any other points in Marion's question? No. Ian, you want to bring? Yes.
I've got a pre-written question as well, David, in regards. You've probably touched on some of it already, but you have. But there's some other points maybe I'd like to, maybe for you to expand on, because you touched on it earlier. But it says, can you give us examples of good practice for commissioning in Dumfries and Galloway or elsewhere across Scotland or the UK? So you maybe touched on that as well, but you speak about preferred bidder stroke contractor status as well. And I'm interested in that, how that could be improved, how the council could possibly build that into the commissioning, because we've got an example earlier for Darcas in regards to there only was actually one provider. So it was almost a pointless exercise, 190 pages going through that, when we could have actually that type of preferred bidder process through the commissioning process. But I'm also interested in, have you got any experience in regards to productivity and the difference between third sector's level of productivity compared to the public sector and the private sectors? Is there a difference early on, Pat? Because productivity, and that I'll put that in the context. It's we're trying to get better value for money, so to speak. We're trying to provide as good or a similar service as what we've got already, but for less money. And that's where I think productivity levels is there clear examples where you can see better productivity through different types of organisations?
Yeah, I have to be right up front with you, Councillor Carruthers. No, I can't give you those examples. I'll go away and find ones, okay? You put a challenge out to me. Not off the top of my head. And it does worry me sometimes, you know, when we go, oh, they do it well in Edinburgh, and then you discover actually they do it well in Edinburgh because there was a bit of hoo-ha, and actually 6 months later it's not necessarily working. But if you put a challenge down there, I think we need to go and look at that. In terms of productivity, you need to be clear that people that work in the third sector tend to be of a type that are committed to why they're there rather than the salary level. And in saying that, be absolutely clear that the level that the local authority pays in terms of a job of exactly of equal worth and complexity, you're paying at least a third more than the third sector. So you get value there already. Whether that's right, of course, I think we could have a political and maybe even a party political debate about, but that's a reality. My experience of individuals working in the third sector is that their productivity levels are high in the main. There are, however, ones that you have to get rid of. I was right up front, you know, not everyone is the same in any organisation, but generally speaking, people working in the third sector are very committed, lower salaries than the public or private sector, and delivering high standards, delivering to high standards. Will commissioning improve productivity? I don't know, I would hope so. I would hope that process of actually involving people in a discussion about what you're actually delivering, what you need to deliver, improves productivity, because I have a sense that as is often the case in any organisation, regardless of which sector it's in, you'll have people doing jobs that are not related to what the purpose of the organisation is, and that's just because it's happened over time. And we don't spend enough time reflecting on that, reviewing what the purpose of that job is, and moving that job on, stopping it, in fact. There is an inertia in all organisations. So I mean, in a sense, what I'm saying to you is that my hope is that as a collaborative process, and this is not mine, you know, this is well documented as a process, should lead to better services and improved productivity.
I can talk about one service, and this is in another local authority where we looked at, together with the council and quite a number of the departments, lots of different organisations and agencies about, and it was very specifically about alcohol-related brain damage, looking at what needs to happen. For the costs were really high because people were ending up in care homes for years on end because people just didn't know what else to do with these individuals who came with these problems, and people were recovering, but they were still languishing in care homes at a very high cost to the council, actually. And so the council were looking at what could we do, what could we make a difference, got all the agencies around the table, the individuals themselves, families, what needed to happen. And it was a very collaborative approach. And the organisations that I was working with at the time was working with people with alcohol-related brain damage, working very closely with them, and they did a number of presentations and a number of sessions with councillors and with different organisations about what could happen. And the upshot was we developed a service for people with alcohol-related brain damage, which was, I suppose, could be described as a care at home service, with the idea of getting people out of care homes and with the maximum independence and minimum support out in the community. And it was hugely successful because we got people out of care homes that had been in there for donkey's years, just languishing in there. And I can remember one man in particular, we got him out, he'd been on 24-hour care, he had full guardianship, we had him out of the care home. Over time, we'd worked very closely with the care home, with other agencies, receiving 1 hour a week support, and he was back at work, but very different work than he'd done. And we were proving that actually we could do this with and for some individuals who there was very high cost associated with. And that had been very much a collaborative approach, but it really worked. And the bottom line is, for some of the most vulnerable people, the outcomes for them were fantastic. They had moved from passive recipients of care to active citizenship. And that was a huge, and for the family, that was a huge knock-on effect. That was, and there are various other examples of that kind of work across different local authorities that I've been involved with that have been very successful, but take a very much a collaborative approach to get there.
There's also, Councillor, in response to Councillor Crowther's, another way of looking at productivity, which is not just a financial bottom line. So, you know, any of the management studies in a multiple bottom line. So there are tools like social return on investment that enable you to look at impacts in a very different way from just the financial bottom line. But you can actually then take those bottom lines and put an amount on them. So just because we've just done it recently, we did a little pilot project with, I've just forgotten what it's called. There's a run in Dalbeattie, the Mountain Challenge or something. I can't, Hard Rock Challenge, yeah. And we did a social return on investment on that, and we estimate that for every £1 of input into that event, so measuring it across all sorts of things like, you know, people's physical activity and so on, we're well above £35 worth of output. Now that's putting a number on something, and it's not an exact science, but it does. If you take those approaches to productivity, it gives you a different view. It's not a best value view going back to the early late 70s, 1980s. It's just a wider view of an impact of a particular activity, and it just, from my perspective, it allows you to think more widely about productivity rather than just the financial bottom line. You know, the example Heather just gave there, if you were doing social return on investment, you would probably find that there not only was a saving in taking people out of the home that they were in, there's probably all sorts of savings and benefits that you could measure in financial terms across the length of time they lived, their general well-being, the number of times they went to the GP. A whole lot of down the line productivity issues get addressed in that kind of approach.
Oh, thanks. Thank you. I suppose, I mean, if you had a criteria for good practice, what would it be?
That's a very broad question.
Well,
I think the fundamental word here, and my preference is for the word cooperation, but I'll use collaboration. Every time I hear the word collaborative, I just think of films about France and during the war, but collaborators. But anyway, collaboration's probably the word for here. I just think that, you know, if we can get that culture of collaboration right, and I think there is a bit of a journey for us to go on everyone's part, not on one part here, then we create the right culture within which to start delivering a joint commission kind of model across a range of things. And since you've opened the kind of door in my head to some, you know, I think that should also involve thinking very imaginatively and innovatively around things that we currently don't do. You know, so for example, we are engaged in some, I hate the phrase, but I'm going to use it, blue sky thinking around services that don't exist at the moment. So Gordon's chairing a community benefit society that we just set up, which is called Community Asset Management, Dumfries and Galloway Limited, which is about taking on the ownership of properties to bring third sector organisations into those properties, so that they're in an environment where collaboration is encouraged because they're in the same place rather than in multiple different locations around the town. We did a desktop exercise in Stranraer where we estimate, and it's still to be proven this, but we estimated that in rents alone, over £250,000, £250,000 leaks out of the sector in rents. And our view is if you can't completely eradicate that, but you can remove it, and at the same time bring people together in a single building so that collaboration in the third sector actually becomes real. We're looking at transport as an issue where I think there needs to be a greater collaboration, and the other big one for us is care. the delivery of care in the home and how that connects into care in our day centres. With different rates, different ones. Do you want to comment maybe on community asset management as an innovative way of thinking and potentially a collaborative way of working?
Yeah, I think, obviously, my experiences at the Crichton, I think why David picked me for this one.
Picked on you.
But the idea there is that by bringing them together, encouraging them to share resources, encouraging them to work together, encouraging them to innovate. And you also get the issue about, bringing the standards up, because some of the third sector we have here is of national quality and some isn't. And what we'd like to see is by letting people work together and see how the others operate, that you start to pull up the standards and bring them all up to the standard of the best. It's also about projecting the third sector as being a professional organisation. There are people, I think, who may not see some of the third sector as being professional. That's trying to overcome that perception that people might have.
Because I always say, I'm just thinking in my mind, I always think in layman's terms of, so by more collaborative working amongst the third sector and bring up to, it would bring not only more professional standards, but there's leakages where you're saying financial leakage that could actually put more focus on the end user, so to speak.
If we can in a sense complete the circle, so that rents are being used to finance the operations, the buildings and so on, and we can actually charge less than market rents. The particular model we've picked allows people to actually invest in it through community shares. So it's, as what David said, it's a financial model, and it's a new way of funding these kind of things, which I think is going to be very important.
But Councillor Carruthers, you're absolutely right. If we can drive down the costs, then in terms of the end user, more money can get spent on them. I would hope that you drive down costs and you don't just make the saving, because there is that tendency, isn't there? But clearly, let's take this health and well-being agenda. If you've got all those third sector organisations in a community like Stranraer in a single building, still independent and autonomous of each other, but working much more collaboratively. They share the costs of that building. They're sharing reception. They're sharing telephone systems. They're perhaps even sharing IT systems, insurance costs. We've actually got a consultancy firm working on some figures on this for us, but we believe that approach, that collaborative approach, can deliver substantial savings. And you're absolutely right. The objective in that is therefore to be able to deliver more to the end user rather than less. The challenges around creating that collaborative culture just for us in the third sector are huge. I'm not going to pretend that the journey we're on is one that the end is in sight, although there's some quite scary stuff that we've managed to. We've got to a point where I'm serious discussions with a private landowner in Stranraer around something that we might do, and I'd never expected to get that far. But if we're having those same kind of conversations in terms of the commissioning and the design and commissioning of a service with our public sector partners, if you take that collaborative approach and in that conversation, you should also be able to make savings that you can then direct down the line. And it's David's point about, sorry, I'm going to put my arm across you. It's David's point about, if you have a culture that's about competition amongst the third sector to deliver a service, you're discouraging that conversation that perhaps Turning Point should be having with Relationship Scotland. I'm making this up, but a number of organisations about actually designing an end service together that's much more effective than delivering it apart, in silos, as it were. In answer to your earlier question, I think the key thing here is encouraging a culture of collaboration.
Thanks very much.
Andrew?
Yeah. Okay, David, what I was going to ask you is, basically, commissioning is very much supported by and through capacity. What is the current capacity within third sector in our region and also within Scotland?
What is the capacity?
Yes.
we're already in some areas of service delivery well above 80% of all service delivery in Scotland. So, for example, in care, not care at home, but generally care, we're already delivering 80% of services. There are capacity issues. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And some of those capacity issues come back to what I've just talked about, that if you've got, particularly the smaller third sector organisations, if they've got all those overheads in place that we just talked about, you might be able to push out. If they've got all of those in place, then that reduces their capacity to deliver at the end. We haven't even mentioned volunteering yet, but I think there's a capacity issue around volunteering. We have a very high rate of adult volunteering in Dumfries and Galloway, currently about 32-33%, a bit lower than Highlands, we come second, maybe even third. I think we might be slightly behind Borders currently. But the question in my head is, and the third sector, volunteering is the DNA of the third sector, so is that 33%, is that as high as we can get? Actually, there's very little evidence to suggest you can get above that. So we may actually in Dumfries and Galloway be at the peak level in terms of adult volunteering, which is an essential part of what we do. So I think there's a capacity issue there. I'm getting reports from third sector organisations that they're finding it increasingly difficult to get volunteers. Not helped, I have to say, by a central government approach about welfare to work and so on. I'm getting into controversial areas, but people want to volunteer, don't want to be told to volunteer. So there's certainly a capacity issue there. But as a positive side, in answer to your question, we're only limited in our capacity, I think, by our imagination. I know that trips off the tongue rather easily for someone like me, but we are. It's the capacity of our imagination to see a different way of doing things and then getting it done. I couldn't give you figures on capacity issues because I don't think it's measured.
I also extend it to nationally. What you're telling me, is that general across the whole of Scotland, or is it just unique to our own area?
I think the volunteering one's unique here. Because in urban Scotland, volunteering rates that can be as low as under 20%. So I think for us, trying to imagine reaching 35, 36, 40% volunteering rates, I think we're really pushing at a ceiling. Whereas in urban Scotland, there's lots of reasons why people in urban Scotland are not as engaged in their communities as people in rural Scotland. So I do think we have an issue there. I don't know whether there's any hard evidence of what I'm saying, that maybe we could get to 40%, but I just have a gut sense that actually volunteering rates in Dumfries and Galloway are already very high.
You also touched on that you would look at alternative ways of working. We have 3 other local authorities on our board. Do you look at, or are you able to tap into their resources? Is there any communication between you?
Yes. On Monday, I should be at a meeting of the third sector interfaces chief officers from the whole of the west of Scotland. I managed to get included in the west of Scotland meeting when I pointed out that there was a southwest of Scotland meeting, but it's basically me talking to myself and an office in Dumfries. So they've opened it up to me. We have good and regular contact with South Ayrshire as a council, South Lanarkshire. I would say that they have examples of better practice than Dumfries and Galloway Council. And I don't mean that as a criticism. What I mean by that is you can look not too far away and see better ways of working. But I wouldn't just limit that sort of looking towards others for ideas. I would widen that out almost internationally, and have done recently in terms of community transport solutions, where in Australia there's some absolutely fantastic ways of delivering on community transport that we've just never even thought about here locally in Dumfries and Galloway. So I'm actually going over to Tasmania to see my brother later in the year. I'm going to visit this organisation, find out more.
Not an expense.
Not an expenses. No, I'm going to a wedding. But flippant side, the flippant bit of my answer aside, you know, there are good and developing networks around Scotland and the 32 third sector interfaces, and you know, I can pick the phone up, speak to someone, for example, in South Ayrshire around social enterprise. We make those contacts.
I wonder if I could just pick up on Councillor Wood's question. In a sense, the interesting question is the next one. If there's a capacity issue, what do we do about it?
Yes.
And there are essentially two options. One is you can bring in outside providers, or the other one is you can grow your own. And our preference is grow your own.
Yeah, absolutely.
Now, just moving away from that question, and it's going back to something you mentioned yourself with projects in controlled environment, the methodology. What is the methodology that you actually apply when applying PRINCE?
When I applied PRINCE, so PRINCE was designed originally to manage IT projects. So it's in its full form. It's a very intense way of keeping on top of the project. I'll keep it relatively simple, but project board, where all the key players are regularly inputting to why haven't we progressed, what changes do we need to make, absolute control over the progress of the project and making sure that you're responding to barriers and so on very, very quickly. That methodology that was originally used for IT projects is now widely used elsewhere. I'm not particularly a massive fan of PRINCE. I've got a PRINCE qualification and did my head in trying to do it. There are other methodologies. I think that what I would say is that the key phrase for me around whatever methodology you use is this notion of continuous improvement, that you're going through a cycle. I mean, that's what this is about. This is about saying you put in place your design, you do it, you look at what it's doing, you assess it, and then you look at it and you start again. And that, in a sense, PRINCE does that in a project because it's doing it on a weekly basis. What we're talking about is not a project, so you know, is PRINCE appropriate to something like commissioning? Maybe not. Maybe more this kind of continuous review process through a cycle.
So,
I mean, I would look to. I'm always tempted to say to Lorna, because you've used these models before as well, whether they're appropriate to commissioning or not.
We use PRINCE for lots of different projects that the council delivers. I think in terms of commissioning, this is much more about a relationship and an ongoing relationship. So individual projects would apply PRINCE or similar methodology, but I think what's been discussed today is much more about a longer term relationship.
I think what I'm trying to get at here is we're talking about collaboration through commissioning and accountability. If we were working collaboratively and there's going to be a focus group, it would have to be made up of the various partners that are taking that forward. Is that how you envisage taking it?
Yeah, it very much has to be a partnership approach, and we shouldn't be, provided what you put in place is very open, very transparent, that it's not a closed system. You know, I think, you know, I was hoping that was the answer you were going to give. You know, PRINCE is great, that kind of project management is great for doing a specific thing like getting the building at the usual place up and running, and you go through the PRINCE stages. I don't know if that's what they would use, but you could do that. But on the discussion we are having today, I agree with Lorna very much. It is about building those relationships, putting them on really good foundations. You know, part of that's also about the participants being very open and honest with each other, challenging, but at the same time recognising when you challenge, you might have flaws as well. So hence my comments about third sector's not perfect either. So yeah, I agree with you.
I think a lot of these things can actually borrow some of the principles from PRINCE without having to slavishly follow what is quite a bureaucratic process. It's about people understanding what their role is, having a clear and shared objective, and monitoring the progress and understanding the targets that have to be made. And those principles, I think, apply to almost anything that you do.
What Prince does do, though, is if it's worked properly, you have change controls in place that, you know, if you get something happening that shouldn't be happening or is unexpected, the methodology makes you respond to that and do something quickly about it. Whereas, you know, I do think sometimes what we are like, and I'm talking about the whole system in Dumfries and Galloway, not just Dumfries and Galloway, it's a bit like the tanker out in the sea, you know. Moving it and getting it back round and on a different course takes a long time. Prince is a system that encourages you to react quickly. I mean, I think you could have a system of working together that allows for greater and speedier responses to issues. I'm sure you could.
Yep. Alistair Geddes.
I was just
don't know if I was
back.
too quick at jumping in with the last question. So.
Sorry, just to go back to comment that David made earlier about enhanced cooperation. I regard collaboration as a pejorative term, smacking as it does of Vichy, France and Quizzling. So I'll talk about enhanced cooperation. I think that's an eminently sensible suggestion. I think it's one that, you know, really should be pursued. But the thought just occurred to me, Ivor, Dumfries and Galloway Council, correctly, let me say for the record, in my view, are pursuing their policy in relation to their property portfolio of fewer and better. Has there been any contact made between both organisations about the possibility of some of these? And I'm not trying to dump unsuitable properties in the third sector. Let me make that abundantly clear to you. But, you know, thinking particularly in a Stranraer context, for instance, there might just be certain properties in Stranraer which would be eminently suitable for the purpose that David and his colleagues are endeavouring to achieve. And as I say, I would be interested to know if there has been any tentative approaches made in that regard, and if not, why not?
Alistair, I'll talk to you afterwards.
Right, okay.
But can I say, in an open arena where it's being recorded, we did have a look at Dunby House, and I wouldn't touch it now with a barge pole because there are other better options, not because I wouldn't touch the building altogether. You know, both Gordon and I have experience of listed buildings, you indeed have as well, and particularly listed buildings that have been in the ownership of a local authority and pretty much not maintained properly for many years. My preference in relation to Stranraer is something that might be new build, so it's land. But you do raise another question that it is on my agenda to speak to Gavin on Tuesday morning about where we go in relation to the Community Empowerment Bill and asset transfer, specifically in relation to the Community Benefit Society that we've set up. The society we've set up is not only designed to own and develop land and buildings, it's also designed to manage properties. And the reason that's part of our objects is, you know, we are aware that community groups may want to take on their village hall, but they might not then necessarily further down the line have the necessary skills to deal with the ongoing maintenance and management of that property, its insurance and so on. And our intention is hopefully to provide a vehicle that would allow services to be provided to small community groups to manage any building that they took as an asset through the asset transfer powers in the Community Empowerment Act onto themselves. As for the current, I will go on record as saying this, currently your approach as a local authority have emails where this is a stated fact, so I'm not straying into an area of controversy, I hope. Your stated policy is to get the most money, full stop. You know, and as the advice starts to come out on the Community Empowerment Act, we'll have to change that, because that won't be, you know, best price won't be what's most important. Can I say, however, it's not just Dumfries and Galloway Council that we'll have to think about the community power, because Gordon and I had a meeting with Jeff Ace to discuss a building in Dumfries that the NHS is disposing of, and you know, I have to say Jeff was right up for what we were describing. We were hoping to put a couple of third sector organisations together and reduce their overheads in the way I described. And Jeff was really up. I mean, I think I sold the idea to him fairly quickly. He then got his property guys to phone the NHS Scotland and to take advice on whether he could do it, and was told no. You know,
the specific problem we've got is that while we've got new legislation, there'll be another year before the regulations come in. So for the next 12 months, we're kind of still working under the old system, but we'd much, from our point of view, we'd much rather work under the new Act because it provides the kind of powers to do the kind of innovative things that you've identified.
I'm grateful, Ivor. So it is, and also assured, reassured rather, because it's good to know that there's contact is being made, and we really, these are phrases which, you know, as David has already said, you know, they you know, rip off the tongue pretty easily, but sometimes the difficulty in the trick is putting them into action. Thanks.
Yes, question 5, which was to follow on from Andrew's question, but much of the discussion has explored this, but I'm happy to add a wee bit, get my tuppence worth in. What specific steps do we need to take to build the capacity? Before I invite you to answer that, I'd like to say that looking through the documentation here, I encountered something which I can't find again, but we'll find later on. And it seemed to suggest that there's a reluctance from third sector to challenge the authority on certain aspects of things, and almost returning to your theme of elephants, David, like the elephant in bed with the elephant. It might be a nice elephant, but sometimes there's a reluctance there. So is that a bar to building capacity?
Well, bear in mind that that piece of research was done in a way that the respondents were told that their responses were going to be confidential. So it revealed something that I would suspect we already knew, but like the elephant in the room, didn't really want to mention, and that is that many third sector organisations do find it difficult to have an honest conversation with their commissioning or tendering officer. Why? Because that's their source of income, and you don't want to upset, you know, the hand that feeds. It's as simple as that. So I don't think the conclusion of that research tells us anything that we didn't kind of know or suspect, but it does tell us, I think, that we need to change the nature of the conversation. So, you know, when I say that when we meet like this, we have to express our views openly, honestly, respectfully, but we have to express our views, because if we don't, nothing moves forward. So it's not, I don't think we should dwell too heavily on the fact that yes, some third sectors or organisations who are providing or getting money from a local authority or the NHS to do something, find it difficult to then say to them, well, there's a problem here and you should be doing something. I don't have that difficulty.
If it's any consolation, when I was with the Chamber of Commerce, I was hearing the same kind of comments from the private sector.
Yeah.
I would like to think that the council is big enough to accept helpful, constructive criticism and say, well, yeah, you've got a point there, and without prejudice, we're happy to hear what you have to say.
So I stress, Councillor, what's in that report, I think, is just a reflection of human nature, and we have to work to overcome that.
Yeah.
I mean, I on a personal level, you know, I think people who know me know that I will say exactly what I think the issue is, but I try and do it in an open and honest way. It will upset people from time to time, so I don't have that difficulty, but I do know of colleagues that would, you know, who would go, and you can't possibly say that, even although it needs to be said.
Can I just add something from my experience actually of the work over the last 3 years? And yes, probably everybody does know me. And we've certainly had some challenges over the last 3 years. But one of the things that we've thought that would be really helpful to us is that we weren't political in any way. We were not a political bone in our body. We just saw the gap. We thought we need to do something about this. We've got the skills and the capacity really, with a bit of help, to do this. And so we thought, right, how do we do this?
And we knew that obviously there were lots of things to do, like we had nothing to do with buildings, I didn't have a clue about buildings. I never want to see another one again, I have to say, but having gone through all of that and work. But we have had the experience, and we've shared that actually across Scotland now for Big Lottery, some of our learning from that, and in our own region as well. And we had to get to know what the political system was, what the processes were, who we spoke to, who could help, who could assist, who could champion. And I have to say, the councillors and all the councillors that we spoke to were really, really helpful. We did not come across any barriers with that, but what we did lack was knowledge about that as an individual organisation. I can't speak for the third sector, Dumfries and Galloway, but we as an organisation, and there's so much we've learned from that about how we manage that as an organisation and how we get help and how we move things forward, that is actually so useful for organisations to have, and that is about collaboration. So what we have would just be so useful, and I don't know how we capture that and get that out to the other organisations who could make use of that as individual organisations, because that would make a huge, huge difference to people's ability to move forward and know what they're doing. And sometimes it's not always about money, actually. It's about that knowledge and about that the connections and the networks that creates. So that's just an aside on that.
Well, my first meeting with sort of official meeting with Heather was because she'd been told by someone down at Business Gateway that their project wasn't going to go very far because it breached state aid rules, and I have to say my immediate response was that was rubbish, and it was rubbish. So I'll say that openly. It took a day to resolve that particular barrier, but I have to say, Rona, I keep calling her Rona McPherson. What's her married name? Rona was really, really helpful, and we resolved that barrier in fairly quick time. However, you have to recognise that somewhere within the system, someone threw that barrier up in the first place. So for Heather, it was about where did she go to get that barrier out of the way, and she didn't. I mean, that's the knowledge of who can I go to for help, and that's one that's often difficult for really small groups. How do I access someone who can really help here when a barrier goes up, particularly a barrier that's unnecessary?
I'm sorry, you said breached. I missed that.
Breached the state aid rules.
Right.
I have a colleague, an Italian colleague, who once told me, and I won't use the bad language he used, that basically we Brits don't spend enough time ignoring European regulations. In Italy, they have a very different interpretation. We're very legalistic and precise. And well, I'm not going to use the language he used because it's too colourful.
Got Alistair and then Colin.
Thanks. Much more creative in the interpretation, no doubt. Politely. Just going back to the issue of building up the capacity. What I was particularly keen to hear David mention better and earlier involvement of the recipients, as it were, and I hesitate to use the word process, but the whole process. Do you feel that has a slant and a locus and the term building the capacity?
You're actually using capacity, I think, in a different context
Yeah,
from what we know. I mean, normally when we talk about capacity building, we're talking about the ability either of a community or an organisation or a group to achieve its ends. I think, and correct me if I misinterpreted you here, I think what you're concerned about is the capacity of individuals to contribute to the design of the service they received. I think that's a fundamental challenge, particularly if that person has a disability of any sort, and particularly obviously it's a form of mental disability, mental illness. I'm not sure I'm qualified to give you the answer on that. I think there are people much better placed than I am to do that. But clearly, we have people who by the nature of their circumstance it could be a poverty issue. When we know that people who are in poverty tend to get excluded from the kinds of conversations we're talking about. That's particularly true in urban Scotland. and probably equally true in rural Scotland, I don't know, but you know, particularly in some of the sinky states, you know, people who are in the greatest need of services are often the people least able to contribute to the discussion. So there is a big issue there. I don't have the answer, Alistair. It's certainly not my area of expertise. There are all sorts of participation models for doing it, but I'm not sure that they necessarily bring the excluded into the picture. I think at that point that where advocacy comes in, doesn't it? You know, someone advocating on their behalf.
Can I say, Ivor, for the record, that was precisely the thrust of my question. You know, what was really sort of leading on to is that, you know, if we maybe perhaps get ourselves at the frame of mind eventually that the term capacity becomes synonymous, as it were, with the involvement and the input of the recipients as well as the ability of the organisations and the commissioners. Maybe a pious hope. I'll leave it at that at the moment.
Go on. Thank you, Chair. It's actually going right back to the very beginning, and Sheila handed out this first handout, I think it was. I just wonder how involved you were at the time when the application forms went from 4 to 12 to 20 pages, and could you see any logic in the five-fold increase in the amount of questions you were being asked for?
That's very interesting, because I was actually involved with the voluntary sector funding unit at the time when they tried to put the forums together. So I appreciate how difficult it is, and I do appreciate there's not one size fits all. Because I think levels of funding at one point determine the length of a forum. And I think they recognised at the time the capacity within the organisation to go through these processes and complete these forums, sometimes for very, very small pots of money. So I think, you know, we've been involved in it from the other end, where the process has changed and we have to work with what's been implemented, but I have been involved in, you know, working with council officials to put the forums together. But I do think over the years it's grown arms and legs in line with legislative changes. And I'm not sure that there's any benefit to, you know, local authority organisations, yourselves.
I think personally, I mean, not just grant applications, but volunteers in general are put off with the amount of bureaucracy and things they have to go through. I've filled in an awful lot of applications for funding over the last 5-6 years, and a number of times I think, well, what the hell do they need to know that for? That's my thinking. You know, the council's actually not too bad, the forms that they put out for applications for discretionary funding, etc. Some other organisations are a lot more rigorous, but I honestly wonder how many people that have never applied for money from an authority or an organisation are actually just put off and thinking, God, I'm not even going to start doing that. You know, and to me, it should be simplified and streamlined.
Well, we're moving away from commissioning, but can I respond to that? I mean, in the spirit that we were talking about openness and transparency, your forms generally are longer than your sister authorities in South Lanarkshire and South Ayrshire. They ask many more questions. They ask questions which, in my view, are irrelevant to the application. Just depends on the size of the grant. So I think, generally speaking, Dumfries and Galloway's forms are significantly, they're longer. There's, you know, asking in a grant of about 300-400 quid a question about state aid seems to me ridiculous, but there we go. You know, but that's not what commissioning is about. My view is that could be improved. And I want to throw another one in there as well. You know, it's not just the form, Councillor Wiper, it's the whole process, and it is process here. So I know I'm straying well off commissioning, but I think we have to ask the question, are we spending too much on administering monies that we put out to communities in the third sector, and therefore less is going out to communities in the third sector than probably could, because we're spending it all on administration. And I think that, you know, that I was at a community council meeting that Andrew was at, and you know, they were pulling their hair out with one of the forms, weren't they? You know, and so I get it. You know, if you're So finally in this, that's also where we and others can provide those kind of groups and people with help to fill those forms in.
Colin, you want to come
Just
back?
a point on that, you know, the council words that we hear quite a lot, best value, best practice. We are asking that of the people who are delivering the service or the commission, but I think we're actually putting barriers in their way and making them, as David says, that money is not being given to the end user because there's so much of it being tied up in the bureaucracy of the process. And I think if the council to say they want best value, best practice from the commissioner, is they need to look internally at what they're doing first to try and streamline this process so it doesn't cost the deliverer as much money to actually go through the process, if you follow me.
Andrew and then Alistair.
It's really coming back to your point about, and I think you've said it about a dozen times now, we have to find alternative ways of operating, being more efficient and more effective. And then you make a statement about how you're looking for a plot of land to build a new office block. A bit of a contradiction there, and I know that the council is positively looking at a new change in culture in facilities, joint facilities, and I don't understand why you need to even consider building anything new. But in actual fact, if you're going to be working with the council in an integrated way, why we can't facilitate that within our own premises?
I think you may be in danger of confusing a number of issues there. Yes, the council has too much property in its ownership that's way beyond its needs, and communities and the third sector should be given the opportunity of those assets being transferred to them. The particular project that I was talking about, we did look at a council property and we still have it on our radar. Alistair knows it well. It's called Dunby House. But you need to take my word for this. The amount of investment that's needed in it is significant for what you would get out of it, and you wouldn't necessarily get out of that an efficient building, not least in terms of its insulation value and heating costs. Therefore, as we've developed our thinking in relation to Stranraer, and as I said to Councillor Geddes, I'll talk to him off the record after the meeting, it seems sensible to us to explore an option that is new build, because, and you know, and this applies I think to the council too, because in terms of new build, you will save hugely on heating costs and other overhead costs going forward. You might be surprised that a town planner might say this, and I might get a clip in the ears from my former boss. I might get a clip in the ears from, but you know, not every old building's worth saving.
Aye, and that brings back, that statement brings back a lot of memories, but I won't, that's not what we're here for.
I dissociate myself.
It's refreshing, you know. I find it refreshing to hear it being reiterated, and I'm sure I'm not on my own. But that, as I say, well, that's not what we're here for. But I go back to the point that Colin made, and let me say for the record that I agree with him. You know, and I think it's a nice point to put to the Scrutiny Committee, you know, of all other forums, because, you know, at the end of the day, I think if I'm understanding the comments that are being made, you know, you've got to take a balanced and a sensible approach to the pursuit of scrutiny. And if you finish up scrutinising to the nth degree, you know, that's no, ultimately, in my opinion, what it's about. And you're well past the law of diminishing returns by that stage. And I think, you know, that's why I would support Colin and the comments he's expressed. And I think as a committee we should take that on board and perhaps develop it, you know, post this meeting.
It was similar. It was a point that Colin brought up as well. It was in the back of that, but it just was clear in my mind because the bits we picked up on earlier was in regards to what I felt was being conveyed to yourselves was if there's an opportunity to have preferred bidder status, so it's moving from procurement to actual commissioning, then we should take that, really. I think that's what I picked up earlier, because there was only really one organisation which was fit for purpose, so it went from 4 pages, 12 pages, 20 pages, and actually picked up 91 question, 115 pages, I think it was, when there was an opportunity to say, well, there is only one organisation coming and bidding for this, let's just commission this, and then see what comes through that.
And the open and honest conversation should be one party saying to the other, over the past period, you've not really done this as well as we might have hoped. Could we concentrate on improving that? But the other party should be saying, here's something we can bring to the table, perhaps you've not thought about, that would be of real value. Where can we make savings? Where can we do? Who can you go and work with? Are there other things that we are funding that we could put into the mix here? So it's a hugely different conversation you then have than the process of going through filling forms and putting it in an envelope, sealing it, and somebody opening it in. And I noticed that it's officers that do it now. And the time when I was a councillor, councillors opened them. But you know, opening the tender document and then deciding who's the lowest bidder and you go with them. It's a very, very different process, commissioning, in my view.
Yeah, there's another issue in there that, you know, over the past years you've been cutting your budgets and reducing staff, and that process is going to continue. In many cases, the people now with the expertise to help design that service are the preferred bidder, the volunteers of the third sector. And what you do is you get the advantage of that knowledge and expertise in developing the service.
Just because I think it's absolutely appropriate what Colin brought up there, but I just wanted to make sure that I picked up on the point that was conveyed earlier, and that, so thanks for that.
Last point to Alistair, and then we'll bring Jill's final line of inquiry in.
It was just to make a comment, Ivor, and I make no apologies whatsoever for saying it. You know, my view is that, you know, this council should take every opportunity that it possibly can in this context to use the indigenous resources, for want of a better term, in Dumfries and Galloway, provided we can do so in a transparent fashion and that the capacity is there to deliver what we need. And I think that, you know, we've been remiss in the past, as it were, in achieving that objective. I think it's a legitimate objective, as I say, subject to the provisos I've indicated. And I personally have found that the conversation, that is one word I would sign up to on the back of this morning. I found that extremely worthwhile this morning.
Jill?
Thank you. I mean, obviously this morning we're here to take evidence on commissioning services. And I have to say, I find it quite refreshing to see that we've got a common goal, which basically is to look forward and to provide an innovative commissioning service for the future. I too have a set question because we agreed our questions prior to this morning's meeting. However, before I go to that set question, I just think it's quite interesting. I was writing down words that were repeated on numerous occasions this morning. So I always think that's a good thing to do. And it was quite clear that collaborative was a word that was used on a regular basis this morning. Whether or not people felt it was the right word, that's another matter. Innovative, challenging, needs-driven, these are all very important words when we're looking at commissioning services. So I have jotted down just a little paragraph which, in my opinion, after this morning, I think that you're committed to innovative, forward-thinking, collaborative working with all stakeholders. And I mean they're all stakeholders. I don't just mean the council. I mean the private sector, the end users, everybody. But I do understand that you understand yourselves that that's a challenging process, both forward-looking to the council, but also inward-looking as well with your own organisations. But you're also telling me that with the correct dialogue and conversations, you feel that we can get ourselves to that stage where we can get an innovative, forward-looking commissioning service. And for me, that's where I think we need to be. I think it was very interesting to hear some of your comments this morning about how you feel that works for you at the moment or doesn't work for you at the moment, and what we could maybe do to try and change that. Anyway, so now I'll move on to my question, which is, what areas of council business do you consider could be commissioned externally? So what other areas do you think the council should be looking at? from an external commissioning point of view.
This is your
You
chance for a land grab.
opened the door there, didn't
Yeah.
you?
We left the best to last, you see.
I'm going to express a personal point of view here because it's not something I've ever discussed either with my board or my colleagues, but I'm just going to go for it. You know, we live through a very difficult period of time for local authorities, and the more I've thought about it, the more I've come to realise that local authorities have got to do what their statutory responsibilities are first and foremost, and deliver well on those. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't other things as a community that we should be doing. So I would certainly be looking at any area of delivery where there is not a statutory responsibility and could be delivered by other means. You know, there are obvious ones in my view around that. There's youth work. There's a whole range of stuff around adult learning and community capacity building. That's first and foremost in my mind that does not necessarily need to be delivered by a local authority. And indeed, as you look around Europe, isn't delivered by your local authorities, but local authorities have an input into how it's delivered. So there's those areas. I think that there are dangers at looking at some other. There's equally dangers at looking at things that could be, if you like, externalised. I know that's an old word, but you know, so there are things you got to be very careful about. Saying another sector to do it, it's a bit like the passing an old listed building onto the third sector to live in. You know, it's not necessarily the best thing that we can do. The same might apply to things like swimming pools and so on. You know, there was a time where you recall putting those out as arm's length organisations and into the third sector was all the rage because we thought we would be able to do them profitably. So there's clearly areas I think the third sector should avoid, and running a swimming pool might be one of them. And I say that with full knowledge of how difficult it's been for Kirkcudbright and Lockerbie to achieve those ends. So you've got to be very careful that you don't expect another sector to deliver what local government found it difficult to deliver. That's not to say you don't do it, but you have to go into it with really open eyes. There are, I think in terms of, I mean, I'm not going to give you a full answer, I'm just picking on certain things, that there are some aspects of community engagement work that we do, you know, participation work, where I think a neutral partner doing it, and I hope Lorna understands what I mean by a neutral partner, that there is a sense that I get from it there. I've heard it said very recently, why are you asking us that question again? You asked us it a couple of years ago, we gave you the answer's still the same. And an awful lot of consultation goes out to communities, and it's not regarded as helpful. They feel over consulted but not participated. So I think there's a role for the third sector to play in community engagement work. In terms of statutory services, I do think there's a role for the third sector, clearly, to be engaged in the delivery of statutory services, and for the council to have the oversight role. You're already doing that widely across care. We just need to get better at it. So there's a broad. I mean, I could give, if you gave me the time, you know, a couple of days, I could sit down and write you a pretty comprehensive list. I think I would want to do it with my board and not in the way I've just done it there, because I suspect there might be different views.
Thank you for that. I think I would just like to put on the record, for me it's about best value and not the cheapest price. And I think that's important. I think people tend to misunderstand that concept on occasions.
See, I wouldn't even. I think best value too has been overused. For me, it's about social impact, social and economic impact. So about the health and well-being of the people out there, the communities out there, and their prosperity.
But for me, that would come under best value.
Yeah. Okay. So different. You see, people like Councillor Geddes and I can be quite pedantic when it comes to language.
I would never say that about Councillor Geddes, ever.
It's either a fault or something else we share in common.
Oh, yeah, it's a virtue.
Get the language right.
Just expand, David, because you're saying you'd be interested in non-statutory. That was a really off-the-cuff question, so to speak. You're not really fully ready for that at all. But you spoke about non-statutory, but care and home care is right in the middle of that. So, and that's a statutory duty to the council, really. So.
Yeah, no, I think I was making it clear. I think local government does a lot of things there's no statutory responsibility for. I think all of that it should consider, putting out the house, because you need to focus on the statutory and getting the statutory right. But we're also currently, as a sector, delivering a huge range of statutory services on behalf of local authorities. So, I'm recognising that. But I was asked, what would I put out that was different from the current position? I'm not saying that you take those things back in-house. In fact, I think there's sometimes a danger in taking certain activities that are statutory functions of the local authority in-house. There's a different culture then than you might be able to deliver if it's done on a commissioned basis. I mean, I keep stressing, Chairman, the thrust of my argument is moving towards this as a system, not a process, but a system of working.
Follow for Ian and Alice.
Just if I could ask for that response to it, a written response to that. I know that I'm saying that, David, because it's quite clear it was about all services, and I think you do need time to. I think that was the biggest question today. I think. But you
any idea what my work was like?
But it's important. Yes, if we get our evidence and look at it.
Actually, Councillor Colour raises an interesting point there. I'm quite happy that if the committee wants me to provide written responses to some of the questions this morning, I'm prepared to do that.
And just because it's both statutory and non-statutory, I like to hear the broad right across where you think the third sector could be fully involved.
Chairman, I hope that one of the key messages we put forward today is that the interface as a whole wants to see this not as an end, but as a beginning. The beginning of a dialogue, that we become part of the process to help design a better system for achieving what we all want to see.
Alistair?
I was just, thanks, Chairman. Just going back to the point that David made, if I understood him correctly, or if I'm being totally honest, if I heard him correctly, the talking about the possibility of youth work. And I would say that some of the small communities in the South Matters, Port William, Isle of Whithorn, Garrison, Sorby, were involved with sort of provision of their own youth work facility comparatively recently. So it might be worthwhile, sir, trying to get some indication, if it's felt appropriate as to how effective that was seen to be, and what the challenges and the difficulties were, as well as the opportunities.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I think, Councillor Leslie, if I can perhaps express my answer in a different way. The whole ambit of what the Scottish Government the three parts to the stool: youth work, adult learning and community capacity building, needs to be a partnership approach. Indeed, the community planning partnership that we get, and Chief Officer's Group, we get any reports on that. And I think large parts of it are already delivered by others, and I think developing that partnership with an approach to delivery of that service is really important. It's interesting, you look at what little legislation exists around community learning and development. It's about, from memory, Lauren, it's about 4 clauses that says you should have a strategic plan and make it happen. It doesn't go into any further detail, so you kind of have an open book about how you deliver it, and it's in those kind of areas I think that delivery by the third sector is probably more appropriate in my view than by the council.
Well, I think we've had a good discussion around that, and that I'll go forward to hopefully influence and shape our recommendations to full council. If we just go to the recommendations within the report, we've received the presentation. I'm happy with that. And agree that this should be added to the evidence gathered for the Commission's scrutiny review.
Agreed.
Do we need to, sorry, I was going to say, do we need to add that specific point about the question 6?
Yes, please. If we could just add in that we would expect a written response to question 6, because there may be things that you wish to add in.
Yeah. could I take this opportunity to thank Sheila, Heather, David, Gordon and Dave for coming along. You are more than welcome to stay for the rest of the meeting. But if you feel that this is an opportune time to go and spread the good news elsewhere, you can leave as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
What number is on the vote?
If you haven't been to the usual place for your lunch, do come.
If we move on to item 5 now, scrutiny review, phase 2 commissioning, actions and next steps. This report sets out the next steps in the review, which is to analyse all the evidence that we have taken over the last year and develop our findings and recommendations at September preparatory workshop. Anything within the report that members wish to comment on?
What date are you doing this?
Your September workshop, we're just waiting for a date, because we had a date for the preparatory workshop which we took for one of the locality visits, so we just need to find a date in
The only
September.
reason I was asking that is obviously we've asked for a written response to something, so we just make sure that we've got it before we do this next part.
Members are happy. Come to the recommendations. We're asked to note progress and action taken for phase 2.
Can I go back to my hobby talks? I mean, what good hard work and effort has been put into this process. Why not make it noted and approved in progress?
Yeah.
Not also the right properly, we'll put that and make that part of the official archive. That we've noted it, but we've also approved it.
Do that. Yeah. And 2, review and agree the next steps for the scrutiny review as set out in the appendix. I have no further business. That concludes our formal business for today. To thank members for their attendance and contributions today. The end of the procurement and commissioning review is in sight. Our next workshop is in September. That date will be notified as we're still looking for us.
We've got a date in the calendar, sorry, for 30th of September, and is that a whole day thing?
That's for one of the locality visits, but we'll just confirm with you the date, because we're also trying to get dates for the visits to other councils. So we're just trying to make sure that we spread the load out before you
And
get the workshop, and the next meeting's October.
I know, it says December in here.
October
15th.
Skipping one. So October. So thank you all for your attendance today.